Who did this to you, Father? Look at me and tell me who did this to you.
It was.
Tell me who did this to you. Who was it?
It was. The chairman.
A bullet can end a life in a second, but a debt of honor can span a lifetime. Most men in my position keep their enemies in the ground. I found mine begging for scraps in the mud. Rain can wash away blood, but it can never drown the truth hiding in the shadows of the soul docks. While the most feared Mafia boss in the underworld, Baek Soo-min, stepped out of his armored sedan to execute a common thief, it wasn't the smell of salt and engine oil that stopped him cold. It was recognition. While Soo-min's elite crew stood ready with weapons drawn, waiting for the order to kill, a disheveled beggar, a man with no name worth remembering and nothing left to lose, looked up from the grime. He didn't beg for his life. He didn't plead for mercy. But as Soo-min looked into those hollow eyes, the polished navy suit and the sharp jawline of power didn't matter anymore. He didn't see an enemy, he saw the ghost of a man who once bled so that Soo-min could lead. Tonight, the man who controls the city's concrete empire is about to do the unthinkable. He is about to learn that true power isn't the ability to pull a trigger, but the courage to kneel before the man who gave him everything. If this moment of honor gives you chills, smash that like button and share this story with someone who believes that loyalty never dies. Subscribe and hit the bell, because next week we're dropping the tale of a billionaire's forgotten daughter and the secret that could burn his legacy to the ground. The salt-heavy air of the Incheon docks always tasted like cold iron and secrets. At 2 a.m., the only lights were the flickering amber street lamps reflecting off the oil-slicked puddles and the rhythmic, distant hum of a cargo ship's engine. Baek Soo-min stepped out of the back of his armored sedan, the heel of his polished dress shoe clicking sharply against the wet asphalt. He adjusted the cuff of his navy blue tailored suit, his face a mask of stone as he looked toward a circle of his men gathered near the edge of Warehouse 7. Boss, his second-in-command, a man whose rigid posture mirrored the steel shipping container surrounding them, stepped forward and bowed. We caught a shadow siphoning fuel and copper from the storage units. He's been a ghost for weeks, but we finally cornered him. Soo-min didn't respond immediately. He took a slow breath, the damp November chill doing nothing to soften the sharp, athletic lines of his frame. He walked toward the center of the group, his crew parting like a dark sea to reveal a figure slumped on the ground. The thief was a disheveled heap of rags and exhaustion, a man who looked as though he had been chewed up and spat out by the very city Soo-min controlled. A heavy handgun lay on the floor just inches from the beggar's trembling hands, tossed there by a guard to signify the man's total surrender. The beggar didn't reach for it. He sat on his knees, his messy, graying hair matted with grime and his head bowed in a posture of total submission. He looked like a man who had long ago run out of luck, out of hope, and out of reasons to fight. "Look at me," Soo-min commanded, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that usually preceded a final sentence. The man flinched, his slim, rugged frame shaking under a faded jacket. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head. His eyes were red and watery, his face tense with the raw, silent terror of a man looking death in the eye. Soo-min reached for the weapon tucked into his waistband, his fingers grazing the cold metal. The crew stood in a silent semicircle, their stern faces illuminated by the harsh overhead lights, waiting for the familiar flash of violence. But as the yellow light hit the beggar's face, Soo-min froze. The air in his lungs turned to lead. Behind the light stubble and the hollowed cheeks of a starving man, a ghost emerged. It was a face he hadn't seen in 30 years, but one he had searched for in every shadow of his empire. The gun remained in its holster as the most powerful man in Seoul felt the world beneath his feet finally begin to shatter. The silence that followed was heavier than the damp river fog. Baek Soo-min's hand, which had never trembled while holding a blade or signing a death warrant, now shook as it pulled away from his holster. He ignored the confused murmurs of his crew and the rigid, watchful stance of his second-in-command. The only thing that existed in the world was the man in the mud, whose eyes were wide with a terror that Soo-min knew he didn't deserve. G1. Soo-min's voice cracked, the cold authority vanishing into a raw, desperate whisper. The beggar flinched at the sound of his name, a name he hadn't heard spoken with anything but spite for years. He looked up, his mouth trembling and his face tense from a lifetime of crying in the dark. He didn't see the Mafia boss, he saw the ghost of a boy he had once pulled from the gutter. In a movement that shattered every rule of the underworld, Su-min did the unthinkable. He didn't pull his gun, and he didn't deliver a strike. Instead, the most powerful man on the docks lowered himself. His expensive navy blue trousers hit the wet, oil-stained mud without a second thought. He knelt on one knee, a symbol of humility and urgency that made his guards gasp and shift their weight in shock. Su-min reached out, his hands gripping Ji-won's thin, ragged shoulders firmly but gently. He leaned forward, his eyes glossy and brimming with a guilt that no amount of power could wash away. The crew behind him stood paralyzed, their stern faces frozen in disbelief as they watched their kingpin bow before a ghost. The gun on the floor was forgotten, a useless piece of cold metal in the face of a 30-year debt. "I've been looking for you," Su-min said, his voice thick with empathy and distress. "I thought I'd lost you to the shadows of this city." Ji-won's hands, rough and calloused, instinctively gripped Su-min's arms as if he were trying to determine if the man in front of him was real or just another hallucination born of hunger. His expression shifted from fear to a staggering, tearful disbelief. He had expected a bullet, he had received mercy. Su-min held him tighter, his body language protective and apologetic, shielding the broken man from the harsh stares of the Mafia crew. In that moment, on the rain-slicked docks, the hierarchy of Seoul vanished, leaving only a powerful leader showing a vulnerability that left the night itself feeling still and hollow. The smell of the docks faded, replaced by the stinging scent of cheap cigarettes and rotting trash in a narrow alleyway 20 years younger. Back then, the neon signs of Seoul didn't offer glamour, they only cast long, jagged shadows over two boys who owned nothing but their loyalty to one another. Baek Su-min was barely 20, a low-level street soldier with more ambition than sense, cornered against a brick wall by 3 rival enforcers. He had been cocky, thinking his fists could outrun a debt his superiors hadn't authorized. One of the enforcers, a man with a jagged scar across his nose, stepped forward, the streetlights catching the lethal glint of a switchblade. Su-min braced for the impact, his lungs burning and his vision blurring from a previous blow to the temple. He was ready to die in the dirt, just another nameless statistic in the gang wars of the early 2000s. "Su-min, move." The shout didn't come from a savior in a tailored suit, but from Yu Ji-won, a boy just as thin and desperate as Su-min, but with a heart that hadn't yet learned how to be cold. Before the blade could find Su-min's chest, Ji-won threw himself into the gap. There was no cinematic pause, only the sickening, wet sound of steel tearing through a denim jacket and sinking deep into flesh. Ji-won didn't scream. He let out a choked gasp, his fingers clawing at the enforcer's arm to keep the man from striking Su-min again. Blood, hot and terrifyingly bright, began to soak through Ji-won's shirt, spilling onto the concrete between them. Even as the light began to fade from his eyes, Ji-won's only focus was pushing Su-min toward the alley's exit. "Run," Ji-won had wheezed, his voice bubbling with a heavy, metallic rattle. "Don't look back. Just run." Su-min hadn't run that night. He had fought like a demon to drag Ji-won's limp body to a back-alley clinic, promising the stars that he would spend the rest of his life making it up to him. But as the years turned Su-min into a kingpin and the underworld swallowed Ji-won whole, that promise had become a haunting echo. Now, kneeling in the mud of the present, Su-min felt the phantom sting of that old blade. He looked at the man he had finally found, realizing that while he had been building an empire of concrete and chrome, the man who had bled to give him a future had been disappearing into the very gutter where they had started. The transition from the cold, oil-slicked docks to the silent luxury of the penthouse was a blur of tinted glass and hushed engine hums. Su-min didn't let the guards touch him, he supported Ji-won personally, his arm wrapped firmly around the older man's fragile frame as they ascended 40 floors above the city that had tried to bury them both. When the elevator doors slid open to the expansive, marble-clad living space, the air was warm and smelled of sandalwood, a sharp, almost painful contrast to the salt and decay of the waterfront. Su-min led Ji-won to a plush, velvet sofa that cost more than a year of the beggar's stolen fuel, but he didn't care about the mud now staining the fabric. He knelt again, not in the mud this time, but on the polished hardwood, gently unlacing Ji-won's worn, waterlogged shoes. The elder man sat in a state of catatonic shock, his eyes darting across the high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows, looking like a forest creature trapped in a glass cage. His trembling hands reached out, hesitating before touching the soft material of the couch as if expecting it to vanish at any moment. "You aren't a guest, Ji-won," Su-min said, his voice dropping the steel of a kingpin for the softness of a younger brother. "This is your home now." Su-min signaled to his personal staff, who stood in the shadows with stunned expressions, to bring the finest silks and a warm meal. He ignored the buzz of his phone, the frantic messages from his lieutenants demanding to know why an enemy thief was being treated like royalty. In this sanctuary of chrome and shadow, Su-min finally saw Ji-won in the light. The rugged stubble and messy hair couldn't hide the deep, red watery eyes of a man who had expected a bullet but received a palace. As a steaming bowl of juk was placed before him, Ji-won finally looked at Su-min, his mouth trembling with a relief so profound it looked like agony. Su-min reached out, placing a hand over Ji-won's, leaning forward with an expression of intense focus and protective concern. He was no longer just a powerful leader with a hidden soft side, he was a man finally beginning to pay a debt that had been accruing interest in his soul for 20 years. Tonight, the beggar was the most important person in the empire, and the boss was determined to make the world regret every moment it had spent breaking him. The atmosphere within the penthouse changed the moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut, separating the inner sanctum from the rest of the empire. Downstairs, in the shadowed corridors of the building and the smoke-filled backrooms of their private clubs, a different kind of fire was beginning to smolder. Su-min's elite crew, men who had been raised on a diet of absolute strength and merciless retribution, felt the foundation of their world shifting in a way they couldn't ignore. The image of the gun left abandoned on the rain-slicked docks burned in their minds like a brand. To them, a weapon on the floor was more than just a piece of metal, it was a symbol of a king who had dropped his guard. In the semicircle of soldiers who had witnessed the kneeling, the shock had curdled into a cold, sharp resentment. They stood in the elevators and parked cars, their stern faces illuminated by the green glow of dashboard lights, exchanging glances that required no words. He knelt, whispered the second-in-command, his voice tight with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning betrayal. He knelt in the mud for a thief who was stealing from our pockets. A man like that is a liability, not a leader. The whispers spread through the ranks like a virus. The younger soldiers, tall and muscular men who wore their suits like armor, began to question the hidden soft side they had once ignored. They had followed Su-min because he was the most powerful figure in the room, someone used to total command and control. But seeing him apologetic and emotionally invested in a beggar felt like a breach of contract. They didn't see the found family trope or a debt of honor, they saw a predator who had lost his teeth. Inside the penthouse, Su-min could feel the shift in the air, a drop in the emotional temperature of the building that had nothing to do with the thermostat. Every time he caught a glimpse of his security detail through the security monitors, he saw the rigid stances and the earpieces that seemed to hum with secret conversations. The loyalty that had been the heart of his empire for a decade was beginning to fray at the edges. By treating an enemy like a brother, Su-min had inadvertently painted a target on his own back. The mutiny wasn't a roar yet, but the low, rhythmic thrum of restless soldiers was a warning. In the world of the Mafia, mercy is often the first step toward a grave. The velvet curtains of the penthouse moved slightly as the central heating hummed, but for Ji-won, the warmth was an intruder. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his slim frame silhouetted against the glittering Seoul skyline. He had been scrubbed clean and dressed in expensive silks, yet he looked more out of place here than he had in the mud of the docks. When he heard Su-min's firm footsteps approaching, Ji-won didn't turn around, he simply tightened his grip on the edge of a mahogany table. "I can't stay here, Su-min," Ji-won whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. "Look at me. I'm a ghost, a thief. Your men, they look at me like I'm a disease eating away at your strength. I'm a burden you can't afford to carry." Su-min stopped a few feet away, his athletic build cast in shadow, his sharp facial features softening as he watched the man who had lost everything. "You aren't a burden, Ji-won. You're the reason I'm standing in this room instead of rotting in that alley 20 years ago." Ji-won finally turned, his eyes red and watery, reflecting the shame that had become his only companion. "That was a lifetime ago. I took a blade for a brother, not for a mafia king. If I stay, they'll kill us both. Let me go back to the shadows where I belong." He moved toward the elevator, but Su-min stepped into his path, his posture losing its command and shifting into a symbol of urgent humility. Su-min reached out, his hands gripping Ji-won's shoulders firmly but gently, leaning forward with an intensity that demanded focus. "You think you're the one who's been suffering?" Su-min's voice broke, glossy with a guilt he had carried through every board meeting and every gang war. Every time I bought a suit, every time I expanded this empire, I saw your blood on the concrete. I built a throne on the sacrifice of a man I couldn't find. For decades, I've been a king who couldn't protect his only friend. The confession hung in the air, thick and heavy. Su Min's expression was no longer one of dominance, but of deep distress and apology. He wasn't just a powerful leader showing mercy, he was a man begging for the chance to be whole again. If you walk out that door, you're sentencing me to live with that guilt for another 20 years, Su Min said, his mouth slightly open as he spoke with desperate reassurance. Ji-won looked at him, the relief in his eyes mixing with a slow, agonizing realization. He had spent years believing he was a nobody with no last name worth keeping, never knowing that in the heart of the city's most feared man, he was the only thing that actually mattered. The silence in the lower levels of the Ashford corporate headquarters was sharper than the winter wind outside. While Su Min remained in his penthouse, emotionally invested in the man he had rescued, his second-in-command, Barrett, stood in a windowless sub-basement that smelled of damp concrete and betrayal. Across from him stood the representative of a rival syndicate, a man whose presence felt like a jagged blade in the dark. Su Min has lost his focus, Barrett said, his voice cold and devoid of the loyalty that had once been the bedrock of their organization. He knelt in the mud for a ghost. A king who bows to a beggar is a king who has already surrendered his crown. The rival leader leaned forward, his face illuminated by the dim light of a single hanging bulb. You want us to clean up the mess for you? To remove the beggar and the boss in one sweep? Barrett didn't flinch. He was a man used to command and control, and he saw Su Min's mercy as a terminal infection eating away at their empire's strength. To the crew, the gun Su Min had left on the floor was a sign that their leader had grown soft, more interested in redemptive tears than the iron-fisted authority required to hold half of the underworld. The beggar is the target, Barrett clarified, his eyes devoid of empathy. Su Min is too protective, too guilt-ridden to see the trap. If the beggar disappears, Su Min either breaks or he remembers who he is. Either way, the weakness must be cut out. A deal was struck, a paper trail of betrayal that would lead the rival gang directly into the heart of the Ashford estate. Barrett watched the shadow of the rival disappear, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. He believed he was saving the empire, failing to realize that by targeting the heart Su Min had finally found, he was inviting a fire that would devour everything in its path. The mutiny was no longer just a whisper in the halls, it was a sharpened edge, poised to strike at the very moment Su Min thought he had finally found peace. The dining room was a cathedral of glass and shadow, but Su Min had ignored the long, formal table, opting instead for a small circular nook that overlooked the city lights. The harsh, clinical glare of the penthouse had been dimmed to a warm amber glow, softening the sharp facial features of the man who usually ruled through fear. Ji-won sat wrapped in a heavy robe, his hands still trembling so violently that the silver spoon clattered against the porcelain bowl of juk. Every time the metal struck the dish, Ji-won flinched, his eyes darting toward the door as if expecting the Mafia crew to burst in and drag him back to the mud. Su Min watched him with a deep, glossy empathy, his broad shoulders relaxed in a way his men never saw. Without a word, he reached out and gently took the spoon from Ji-won's shaking fingers. It was a shocking emotional moment, a man used to command and control now performing the most humble of tasks. He leaned forward, fully focused on the broken man in front of him, and began to feed him slowly, one quiet mouthful at a time. Eat, Su Min whispered, his mouth slightly open as he spoke with a desperate, reassuring tenderness. You've spent enough years starving for the sake of my survival. Ji-won's expression was a mask of relief mixed with staggering disbelief. As he swallowed the warm food, a single tear tracked through the stubble on his rugged face, leaving a clean trail on his skin. He looked like a man who had expected punishment but received a mercy so profound it hurt more than a blow. Su Min's body language remained protective and apologetic, his hands steady as he offered the nourishment Ji-won had lacked for decades. Outside the door, the security detail stood like statues, their stern faces illuminated by the cold hallway lights. Through the sliver of the doorframe, they witnessed the scene, the feared kingpin of the Seoul underworld lowering himself to play the role of a servant. To Su Min, this was the beginning of a redemptive transformation, to his men, it was the hidden soft side that signaled the end of an era. They watched their boss show a vulnerability that they found more dangerous than any rival's bullet, unaware that this meal of mercy was the only thing keeping Su-min's humanity from fading into the same shadows he had finally escaped. The private shrine on the outskirts of the city was a sanctuary of white stone and flickering candles, built to honor the men the underworld had claimed. Su-min stood at the altar, the sharp lines of his navy suit stark against the soft glow of the incense. He had brought Ji-won with him, wanting the man to see that his sacrifice 20 years ago was the foundation of everything Su-min had built. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the heavy, rhythmic silence of a memorial service. But as Su-min bowed his head, the atmosphere shifted. The semicircle of his crew behind him didn't bow. Instead of the soft rustle of prayer, there was the metallic click of safeties being disengaged. Su-min turned slowly, his athletic build tensing as he found himself looking down the barrels of the very guns he had paid for. Barrett stood at the center, his expression cold and devoid of the loyalty that had once defined him. "The Empire cannot be led by a man who kneels to beggars," Barrett said, his voice echoing off the marble walls like a hammer. "You've grown soft, Su-min. You're more focused on a ghost than the men who bleed for you today." Su-min didn't reach for his weapon. He stepped in front of Ji-won, his body language instinctively protective, shielding the trembling man from the stern, murderous faces of the crew. The betrayal was a fire that choked the air more than the incense. Su-min's eyes were glossy, not with fear, but with a deep, agonizing distress at seeing the family he had built turn into a pack of wolves. "I knelt because I finally remembered what it means to be a man of honor," Su-min replied, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. The rival syndicate's enforcers emerged from the shadows of the pillars, joining Barrett's mutineers. Su-min was cornered against the altar of his own ancestors, his hidden soft side, now a target for those who only understood the language of violence. He looked at the gun on the floor, a discarded weapon near the feet of his former brothers, and realized that the debt he owed Ji-won was about to be paid in blood once again. The mutiny had begun, and as the lights of the shrine were extinguished by the first volley of gunfire, the king realized that his redemption might also be his execution. The gunfire tore through the sanctuary, the flashes of muzzles illuminating the white stone like jagged lightning. Su-min was driven back against the cold marble of the altar, his navy suit jacket shredded as he used his own body as a shield for Ji-won. Barrett's men moved with clinical precision, their stern faces illuminated by the flickering sparks of a dying empire. For a moment, it seemed the hidden soft side of the boss would be his final undoing, leaving him to die in the shadows of the very men he had led. But in the chaos, something shifted. Ji-won, who had spent the last week trembling in silks and velvet, looked up from the floor. As he saw Su-min's blood begin to stain the altar, the red watery eyes of the beggar hardened into a gaze that hadn't been seen in 20 years. The rugged, broken man didn't see a palace or a mafia king, he saw the boy in the alleyway who still needed a protector. A discarded handgun lay on the floor, its dark metal cold against the stone. With a slim, rugged hand that no longer shook, Ji-won reached for it. He didn't hesitate. As a mutineer leveled a weapon at Su-min's head, Ji-won surged forward from his kneeling position with a roar of desperate defiance. He stood tall, his messy, graying hair whipping around his face as he fired with a precision that proved his loyalty hadn't faded with his clothes. The shock of the beggar fighting back sent a ripple of confusion through the mutineers. Su-min looked at Ji-won, his mouth slightly open in disbelief as he watched the man who had been at rock bottom find his old strength. Together, they became a storm of iron and intent. Su-min's athletic build and command paired with Ji-won's raw, protective instinct turned the tide of the ambush. By the time the smoke cleared and the survivors of the crew fled into the night, the altar was silent once again. Ji-won dropped the weapon, his frame heaving with exhaustion, but he didn't collapse. Su-min stepped toward him, his expression glossy with an intense, apologetic pride. He reached out, his hands gripping Ji-won's shoulders firmly, leaning forward to rest his forehead against the man who had now saved him twice. The debt was no longer a burden, it was a bond forged in fire and finished in blood. On that night, the world learned that a man's worth is never found in his bank account or his rags, but in the courage to stand when everyone else expects him to fall. The smoke from the shrine finally settled, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the gunfire. Baek Su-min and Yu Ji-won stood among the white stone and flickering candles, two men who had started as ghosts in the gutter and ended as the architects of a new kind of empire. As the first light of dawn began to bleed through the pillars, Su-min didn't look at the fallen traitors or the shattered marble, he looked at the man standing beside him, whose worn jacket was stained with the price of a debt finally settled. This story of the Mafia boss and the beggar serves as a profound testament to the idea that loyalty is a currency more stable than gold. The first moral lesson is that true power is found in mercy. It took more strength for Su-min to lower himself onto one knee in the mud than it ever did to stand tall behind a desk of glass and chrome. By choosing humility over dominance, he proved that a leader is not defined by those he kills, but by those he is willing to save. The found family, they reclaimed highlights that humanity exists far above social ranks. Whether in a tailored navy suit or rugged, dark casual clothing, the heart remains the same. A title can be stripped away in a single night of mutiny, but the character of a man who takes a blade for a friend is a legacy that no betrayal can erase. The persistence of debt reminds us that good deeds are never truly forgotten, they are seeds planted in the mud that eventually bloom into salvation. The educational value of their journey lies in the importance of recognizing the invisibles in our world. It encourages us to look past the grime and the messy hair to see the scripture written in a person's scars. We are reminded to never be too high to remember the hands that lifted us when we were at rock bottom. As Su-min and Ji-won walked away from the altar, they left behind the world of violence for a future built on honor. Their handshake was more than a greeting, it was a promise that in the high-stakes game of life, the only thing worth keeping is the person who was willing to burn, or bleed, for you.